Imagine for a second that you are tasked with building a brand new democracy entirely from scratch. Where do you even begin with something like that?
Right. That is a huge question.
Yeah, like, do you sit down, draft a flawless constitution, design the perfect electoral system, and just, I don't know, treat it like a structural engineering problem?
Most people probably would start there, honestly.
Right.
Yeah.
Or is that completely backwards? Do you actually have to start by somehow transforming the entire economy, the distribution of wealth, and like the underlying culture, and just hope the political rules sort of naturally follow?
Yeah, that tension right there is essentially the ultimate chicken or egg problem in political science.
Seriously.
I mean, are we looking at a system that can be deliberately designed by architects? Or is a functioning democracy strictly the organic outcome of deep historical forces?
Well, we have a massive stack of historical data, sociological research, and political science to pull from today for this deep dive. And our mission is to answer exactly that profound question. Are we designing the machine, or are we growing the garden?
Okay, let's unpack this, because we are essentially looking for the ultimate shortcut to understanding how political societies actually function.
Right, and to really get to the bottom of that, we have to establish what we are even measuring here.
Always a good place to start.
Yeah, because the word democracy is thrown around constantly, but researchers and everyday citizens really are deeply divided into two very different camps when it comes to defining it. You have the procedural view on one side and the substantive view on the other.
Oh, I always think of this as like the rule book versus the results.
Exactly.
So under the procedural view, which I think was heavily championed by the economist Joseph Schumpeter, it's essentially a minimalist approach, right?
Yeah, very minimalist. The idea is that democracy is just a method.
It's a highly specific institutional arrangement for choosing leaders through competitive elections. So long as you hold regular elections, multiple parties are allowed to compete, and there's, basic freedom of speech to facilitate that competition, you cross the finish line.
You have a democracy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It almost doesn't matter if those leaders enact terrible policies, as long as the process of getting them into office was genuinely fair.
So that is the core of the minimalist perspective. The process is everything. But the substantive view pushes back pretty hard on that, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. This camp argues that a political system cannot genuinely call itself a democracy unless it actually delivers on the implicit promises of democratic life.
Like actual results for the people.
Right. And we're talking about producing social justice, reducing poverty, ensuring a baseline of economic equality.
Because if you have a country that holds perfectly fair elections every 4 years, but, millions of people are starving while a tiny entrenched elite hoards 90% of the wealth,
then the substantive camp argues that the label of democracy is completely meaningless.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense when you look at how everyday people actually interact with their governments. There's a fascinating study we looked at involving 4 distinct Arab populations in the Palestinian territories: Jordan, Algeria, and Morocco.
Oh, I loved reading through that study.
It's so interesting, right? It turns out how you define democracy depends heavily on your immediate life circumstances.
Yeah, the data there is incredibly revealing about human nature. The researchers found that highly educated, politically engaged individuals who are, relatively comfortable economically, they tend to view democracy procedurally.
So they care about the rules.
Exactly. They are primarily focused on the formal structures,
Yeah.
civil liberties, the mechanics of elections, freedom of the press.
Right.
But individuals in those same regions who are facing severe economic struggles do something entirely different. They project their intense desires for a better, more secure life onto this universally praised concept of democracy.
Wow.
Yeah, for someone struggling to survive, a democracy is defined substantively. It is a system that provides basic necessities, shrinks the wealth gap, and creates jobs.
Because, if you're struggling to feed your family, the right to cast a ballot might feel pretty hollow if it doesn't actually put food on the table.
Exactly.
And this tension isn't just an issue for developing nations. It exists in established, wealthy countries, too. There is a really sharp theoretical critique out there arguing that the United States suffers from what is termed electoralism.
Right. The electoralism critique.
Yeah. And the argument here isn't about taking any sort of political side, but rather illustrating a theoretical view that pure procedural justice, just the act of holding elections, can actively mask a lack of substantive democracy.
It's a really interesting lens to view things through.
For sure. The analysis suggests that political labels and cultural identity politics are often utilized in the electoral process to overshadow deeper vertical economic contradictions.
Right, so essentially, the horizontal cultural battles keep people distracted from the massive vertical wealth gaps between classes.
Exactly, just reporting what the analysis says. But it's a powerful way to frame the procedural versus substantive debate.
What's fascinating here is that this debate exposes a brutal reality about governance. While those substantive outcomes like equality, prosperity, justice are what everyday people ultimately want, relying only on the promise of substantive results can create hollow, easily manipulated institutions.
Wait, how so?
Well, authoritarians often justify scrapping elections entirely by claiming they're delivering economic growth.
Oh, right. Like, you don't need to vote. Look at the GDP.
Exactly. However, those procedural frameworks are absolutely essential, especially in large, diverse societies. Why? Because people almost never agree on what the perfect substantive outcome looks like.
Right. I mean, in a country of over 300 million people, we're never going to universally agree on the exact perfect tax rate or, the ideal social policies.
Exactly the point. Procedural democracy provides a neutral framework where deeply divided groups can coexist, compete, and resolve their conflicts peacefully.
Without needing to share the exact same vision of a perfect society.
Right. The procedures allow you to lose an election today, knowing you can try again in 4 years, rather than, resorting to violence.
So procedural democracy is like making sure everyone is playing a board game by the exact same rules.
I like that analogy.
But substantive democracy points out that the game is fundamentally broken if one player starts the game holding all the money before the first dice is even rolled.
Yeah, exactly.
So can a democracy truly survive if the rules are fair, but the outcomes are consistently terrible for the vast majority of the players?
Well, if the outcomes remain terrible for long enough, the players will eventually flip the board. The rules alone cannot sustain the system if the environment is completely hostile to them.
Which means we really have to look past the institutional design and examine the underlying social soil required to actually grow a functioning democracy.
Yes, the soil is everything.
This brings us into the structuralist perspective, or what is often called modernization theory. We're looking at the deep economic and historical roots.
Seymour Martin Lipset famously articulated this back in 1959. His thesis was essentially that wealth, industrialization, widespread education, and urbanization are the absolute social requisites that sustain a democracy.
So as a society modernizes and generates wealth, it naturally creates the conditions for democratic politics to take hold.
Exactly.
He argued that economic development expands the middle class, right? Yeah. And that middle class acts as a massive social shock absorber.
Yes, the shock absorber mechanism is crucial here. Think about a society divided purely into ultra-rich landowners and desperately poor peasants.
Okay, a very polarized setup.
Right. In that scenario, politics is a zero-sum game. The poor want a revolution to seize the wealth, and the rich will use brutal authoritarian violence to stop them.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But when you introduce a massive middle class, you introduce a group that has something to lose. They own homes, they have businesses, they want stability.
So they moderate those extreme conflicts.
Exactly. They prevent society from falling into either an oligarchy or a violent revolution.
But, the historical path to getting that middle class in the first place was rarely a peaceful process of simply building more factories.
Oh, definitely not.
The sociologist Barrington Moore put this incredibly bluntly. He wrote, "No bourgeoisie, no democracy."
No middle class, no democracy.
Right. But his theory was that modern capitalist democracies didn't just emerge politely from the Middle Ages.
Far from it. Moore pointed out that tearing down the old pre-commercial agrarian elite was often a brutal, violent necessity. Mm-hmm. He analyzed upheavals like the French Revolution, the Puritan Revolution in England, and the American Civil War.
Right. Massive historical conflicts.
Yeah. In his view, the old agrarian order, the lords, the plantation owners, they relied on coerced, cheap labor and had zero interest in democratic equality.
Obviously.
So destroying that entrenched elite was the historical price paid in blood to clear the way for commercial, capitalist, democratic societies to emerge.
Let me push back on the structuralist idea, though.
Go for it.
If it's really just about a country getting rich, industrializing, and modernizing, why didn't the oil-rich petrostates become thriving liberal democracies?
Right.
Because some of them have astronomical national wealth, huge cities, and highly urbanized populations, but they are firmly authoritarian.
That is the perfect counterexample to Lipset's original theory, and it's heavily addressed in the research by scholars like Levitsky and Way on democratic resilience.
Okay, what do they say about it?
They point out that it is not just about the total aggregate wealth of a nation. It is entirely about how that wealth is distributed and generated.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah. In a petrostate, the wealth bubbles up from the ground directly into the hands of the state, which is controlled by a narrow elite.
So the government doesn't even need to tax its citizens to function.
Precisely. And because they don't need your taxes, they don't need your consent.
Oh.
Levitsky and Way explain that what sustains a democracy is the concept of countervailing societal power. You need a wealthy, independent private sector and a large, autonomous middle class.
So when economic resources are dispersed widely throughout society, it prevents state leaders from monopolizing political control.
Exactly. Because if the state controls all the oil revenue, they essentially control all the jobs, all the contracts, all the money.
You can't effectively organize a strike or, fund an opposition party if the authoritarian government signs every single paycheck in the country.
Exactly. Without that countervailing power, a high GDP is just a larger war chest for the dictatorship.
Man, that's wild. So history and economics provide the soil. You need that dispersed wealth to push back against the state.
Right.
But history isn't destiny. Human choices have to matter at some point, right?
Oh, absolutely.
It can't just be about whether your country happens to sit on a geographic gold mine or went through a revolution 200 years ago. This shifts us over to the institutionalist perspective, which argues that the strategic choices of human elites and the exact design of the political system dictate whether a democracy lives or dies.
This is where Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson's framework from their book, Why Nations Fail, becomes incredibly relevant.
Oh, yeah, we looked at that.
They look at the battle between what they call inclusive institutions and extractive institutions.
Right, so inclusive institutions distribute power broadly, they protect property rights, and they encourage what economists call creative destruction.
Yeah.
That's the constant innovation that replaces old technologies with new ones, like the automobile replacing the horse and buggy, or the internet replacing the telegram.
But extractive institutions do the exact opposite. In these systems, a narrow elite hoards all the wealth, and crucially, they actively suppress innovation and creative destruction.
Why would they do that?
Because they are terrified that any major economic change will threaten their grip on political power.
Ah, I see.
If a new class of wealthy tech entrepreneurs suddenly emerges, they might demand a say in how the country is run. So the elites crush the innovation to maintain the status quo.
And this perfectly explains the underlying dynamics of the Arab Spring, particularly what we saw in Tahrir Square in Egypt.
Yes, exactly.
Because when those massive crowds first gathered, the authoritarian regime actually offered major economic handouts. They promised subsidies, higher wages, future economic reforms, basically offering to buy them off so they would go home.
But the protesters refused.
Right. They refused.
Because they intuitively understood Acemoglu and Robinson's core point-mirror promises from extractive elites are never credible once the protests stop.
Yeah.
The crowds didn't just want better economic outcomes in the short term. They demanded immediate structural changes to the distribution of legal, on-paper political power.
That they called de jure power.
Yes, de jure power. The protesters knew that without changing the formal, legal rules of who actually holds power, any economic concessions offered on a Tuesday would just be violently revoked the following Monday once the streets were clear.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. We have this concept from the Nobel laureate Douglas North about formal rules versus informal norms.
Oh, this is a great distinction.
Yeah. So formal rules are the Constitution, the written laws, the electoral system. Informal norms are the customs, the traditions, the unwritten ways people actually behave when no one is forcing them to.
Right.
North pointed out that elites can rewrite formal rules overnight. You can draft a new constitution in a weekend, but informal norms take generations to change. You can copy-paste a constitution from a highly successful democracy, but you absolutely cannot copy-paste the civic culture of tolerance that makes it work.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it explains why the physical design of institutions is so incredibly delicate. The International IDA Handbook on Electoral System Design stresses this heavily. You can't just take an electoral system off the shelf and expect it to work anywhere.
Because you have to account for the informal norms and the societal divisions that already exist.
Precisely. Let's look at the mechanism of voting systems. If you have a deeply divided society, say one with 5 distinct ethnic groups, and you implement a majoritarian winner-take-all electoral system, the largest group might win 51% of the vote and take 100% of the power.
Wow. Okay.
The other 4 groups are left feeling completely disenfranchised, which is a recipe for civil war.
Naturally.
But if you carefully engineer a proportional voting system, where getting 20% of the vote guarantees you 20% of the seats in parliament, you force these diverse groups into coalition building. You guarantee everyone gets a seat at the table.
So you really have to design the rules to manage the specific conflicts of the soil. If you ignore those underlying cultural tensions, your perfectly written constitution will just collapse.
It's never an either-or situation. It is a constant co-evolution between the rules and the culture.
So if history provides the soil and elites write the rule book, what happens when you actually plant the seed? Like, how do these two forces collide in the real world?
That's the million-dollar question.
The research describes democracy as a performed assemblage. It's not a static object. It's what happens when the formal rules and the flawed human agents interact.
And we finally have the massive data sets to actually track this evolution historically. The varieties of democracy, or VDEM data set, is staggering.
Oh, yeah.
They analyzed 377 distinct episodes of democratization stretching from 1900 all the way to 2021.
That is a lot of data.
It is. Yeah. And the data reveals a very specific, almost counterintuitive chain of events. They found that holding elections almost always develops first, well before broader civil liberties like freedom of the press, freedom of association, or robust independent courts are fully established.
I found that wild when I read it.
Right.
You would assume you desperately need freedom of speech and assembly before you can have a meaningful election. I mean, how can you have a real vote if you can't freely organize?
Exactly. But the researcher, Staffan Limberg, argues that introducing competitive elections early on, even if they are heavily flawed, actually serves as a vital training ground for society.
So it's basically practice.
Yeah, it forces the development of civic muscle. Even in a flawed election, citizens have to learn how to print flyers, form political parties, knock on doors, and mobilize their neighbors.
Oh, I see.
That organizational infrastructure is precisely what gives society the strength to demand deeper civil liberties later on. The act of voting trains the society to become democratic.
It supports Lindbergh's theory over older models that thought perfect civil liberties had to be locked in before the founding elections took place. It's almost like you don't read the manual to learn how to ride the bike. You just get on the bike, fall off a few times, and the act of pedaling teaches you balance.
That's a great way to look at it, and it ties perfectly into actor network theory.
Oh, break that down for us.
Well, this is a sociological concept that says democracy isn't a machine that just runs automatically once you turn it on. It is an association of human elites and non-human institutions.
Yeah.
The elites use or translate those institutions to advance their own interests.
So if I'm translating that out of the academic jargon,
Yes.
the actual functional nature of a democracy is entirely dependent on the cultural values of the human beings operating the machinery.
Yes.
If corrupt elites run a perfectly designed constitution, you just get a perfectly legalized corrupt state.
Look at the stark contrast between post-WWII Germany and Russia in the 1990s.
Okay.
Germany implemented a brilliant institutional design, but it was coupled with a profound, painful cultural transformation, leading to a highly stable, mature democracy.
Right.
Russia, on the other hand, adopted the formal institutional shell of elections in the 90s, but they lacked a culture of genuine political competition and independent media.
So they had the rules, but not the soil.
Exactly. The result wasn't a liberal democracy. It was a hybrid regime. The rules existed on paper, but they were manipulated by elites in practice to maintain power.
So think about your own workplace or community groups for a second. How often have you seen a perfect set of rules fail because the people running them just didn't buy into the spirit of them?
Oh, all the time.
Right. So is democratization just a dial we slowly turn up rather than a light switch we flip on?
Is building a democracy less like assembling a machine and more like cultivating a garden? You can't just flip a switch to make it work. You have to tend the soil, plant the seeds, and weather the storms for years before you see a strong trunk.
That analogy captures the continuous, fragile nature of it perfectly.
It really does.
But because it's a living garden, it has a dangerous undertow. It can rot. If those informal norms and social conditions start to erode, the formal institutions become incredibly vulnerable to pests. which forces us to look at democratic backsliding.
This is an urgent area of research right now, heavily explored by the scholar Sherry Berman.
Yeah, her work is fascinating.
Her work shows that democratic backsliding is neither sudden nor surprising if you know what to look for. After the Cold War ended in the 1990s, there was this massive wave of optimism, a false sense of destiny.
Oh, definitely.
We assumed human history was on a one-way track toward liberal democracy. The assumption was that once a country reached that status, it was consolidated and safe forever.
We thought we had crossed the finish line.
Exactly.
But Berman points out that the social and economic foundations, the soil of even older established democracies, have been quietly eroding for decades.
We're seeing rising inequality, severe political polarization, and a decline in that crucial middle-class shock absorber we talked about earlier.
Right. People are feeling economically precarious, and they are projecting those substantive desires for security onto strongman figures.
And when the soil erodes, the authoritarian playbook adapts. Today, democracies rarely die from a sudden, violent military coup in the middle of the night.
Right. That's very rare now.
Instead, they die legally. They die through the gradual hollowing out of institutions from the inside. Elected leaders use the very mechanisms of democracy, the courts, the legislatures, the electoral commissions, to dismantle the system, capitalizing on deep societal polarization to justify consolidating their own power.
They use the rule book to destroy the game.
It recalls the philosophy of John Dewey, who argued that democracy requires continuous reconstruction.
Continuous reconstruction. I like that.
Yeah, it is never a static achievement that you can just lock in a display case. It is a living, breathing system that must constantly adapt to the unique technological and economic challenges of every new generation.
So what does this all mean? If democracy is this incredibly delicate hybrid of rigid rules and shifting culture, what actually holds it together day to day?
Well, according to our sources, the rule of law requires a crucial, often completely hidden structural parameter: a professional meritocratic bureaucracy.
Ah, yes. The bureaucrats.
Yes. You can have fair elections and the greatest constitution in the world, but if you don't have impartial civil servants, the clerks, the auditors, the election workers, to actually enforce the rules equally, regardless of who is in power, the whole system falls apart.
Bureaucracy is the unsung hero of procedural justice. Without impartial enforcement, the rules are just words on paper.
Absolutely.
All right, let's wrap this up. We've covered a massive amount of ground today.
We really have.
We started by asking if democracy is an engineered institution or an organic process. And the ultimate takeaway is that it is a delicate, symbiotic co-evolution.
Yeah, that's the best way to describe it.
It absolutely needs the House, the formal institutional rulebook, the voting systems, the Constitution, to provide structure and peacefully manage conflict. But it desperately needs the soil, the civic culture, the dispersed economic wealth, the middle class, and the informal norms of tolerance to provide life, resilience, and legitimacy.
The rules shape the culture over time, and the culture dictates whether the rules are actually followed.
You truly cannot sustain one without the other. It's exactly. So, to you listening, the next time you read a news headline about an election happening somewhere in the world, you now have the tools to look right past the voting booth.
Oh, for sure.
Look at the social foundations beneath it. Are they just holding a procedural election, or do they have the countervailing societal power and the informal norms to actually sustain a democracy?
It changes how you process the daily news completely.
It really does. And I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over on your own. All of the historical sources and theories we discussed today, from Barrington Moore's agrarian revolutions to Acemoglu's inclusive institutions, rely on the concept of the physical nation-state.
Right.
They assume territorial borders, national economies, and highly localized civic cultures. But today, we increasingly live our lives in borderless digital communities. We are governed by transnational tech algorithms rather than national constitutions.
That is a huge shift.
So as we spend more of our lives in these digital spaces, how will the democratic process evolve when our social soil is entirely virtual? When you're trying to build a democracy from scratch, you can't just draw up a flawless blueprint. You have to test the soil. And right now, the ground beneath our feet is changing. Thanks for diving deep with us today.